Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone. I'm Dan from Hasselblad, welcoming you to the first of many exciting webinars this August. Today, we're honored to be hearing from Jennifer K. Levasseur, Ph.D. Jennifer is a museum curator in the Department of Space History at Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and published author of Through Astronaut Eyes, a book which examines the early days of moving and still imagery in space exploration. With such a fantastic topic, I don't want to take up any more time, so we'll do a little bit of screen shuffling while welcoming our speaker today. Jennifer, welcome.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me today. This is the audience I was always hoping that my book would reach, and I feel really honored and pleased that I'm able to do this today. It's just a real treat for me to be able to speak to the community of people who really probably were inspired by some of the imagery I'll share today and some of the things I'll talk about in terms of getting started with their own photography, and they're obviously a passion for this particular brand. And I think, you share something in common with some of the best and brightest out there who've explored our at least nearby solar system. So it's just obviously it's a real treat to be able to talk to all of you today. So let me get started. I just as a way of introducing myself a little bit more, I am a native of Michigan. I went to the University of Michigan and got my undergraduate degree. I didn't really get into photography in any real respect until I started as a graduate student here in the Washington, D.C. area, and took some history of photography courses and really became kind of really interested in just perspective and looking at people in particular. I had an internship at the National Portrait Gallery here in DC, one of the other Smithsonian museums, cataloging photographs. And that's where it all began. So I've been doing this for almost 20 years now in one way or another. And but my passion for spaceflight began long before that. And so it's they kind of came together in a really unique way. When I started my career at the Air and Space Museum, I was able to become curator of our collection of cameras, and thus began a kind of journey, not only to find the pieces of technology that had documented the space age, but really think deeply about what these images mean. Because like any student in the United States in the late 20th century, I didn't feel like I learned very much in school about the space program or even about the 1960s. And so I kind of wanted to see, where do all of these things that I'm interested in come together? Where do they join up? Are there things I should be informed about that I didn't think about before? So hopefully you could all see my screen, and you can see some of the slides I'm going to show, and Dan can correct me if I'm wrong on this.
It's looking great.
Hopefully. All right, great. So I've been at the museum since the early 2000s. Worked my way up, and the culmination of that was a dissertation I started around 2008, finished in 2014 at George Mason University. And this was, like I said, where I brought it all together. And for most PhD students, the ultimate achievement isn't necessarily the dissertation itself, but really carrying that dissertation to the next stage, which is publishing it as a book. And so I was able to do that just this last June. A very exciting opportunity, obviously very interesting time to also be bringing something to fruition. A book being published in the middle of a pandemic, not being able to go out and do book signings or sit in the museum and do talks like we would normally do is a little bit challenging and frustrating, but doing it virtually is definitely working for me. But I wanted to bring to people some not only well-known images, but some images maybe they weren't familiar with, or putting them in a context that they hadn't really understood before. And you'll see on my first slide, I had a title about memory. I had something in there about memory. And so while the publisher, wasn't interested in having a really extensive subtitle, which I can totally understand, this book really is about memory and how images play a role in the creation and sort of the status of our memories of space flight as held by images. And so really, I wanted to make images the sort of turning point here for how we got to a certain point. So it's everything leading up to the capturing of that image, and then what happens after that image returns to Earth. So talking about memory is a bit more descriptive. It reflects really my intent with the book. My argument is really about collective memory. So this age, this period of early human spaceflight is really marked fundamentally by those images. What those astronauts captured on that 70mm film is really, a marker of that period. And how we think about the 1960s is shaped, I think, by that. And by those images, yet no one had really ever sat down in a book and thought seriously about what images of Earth, images of the moon mean in the greater scheme of that period, because of course there was lots of other stuff going on at the same time. It wasn't just about spaceflight as much as some of us would like to think. This is really a story. My book is a story of how this is a shared cultural experience at the time, and interacting with those images on different levels as different audiences. And that's an important part of the story. We're all different audiences and we have different experiences with them. I wasn't born until 1977. So, and I'm sure some of you were born later than that. And so it's really about seeing how these are sort of an intersection for our cultural experience with human spaceflight. It's written from a particularly American perspective. I'm an American, and it's easy to do that. But that doesn't make it exclusively an American story. There's, of course, lots of elements of this that reach across oceans and speak to experiences in other places, obviously, particularly a place like Sweden, or other parts of the world that had some way of connecting to the program through visual culture. And that's really where this study is kind of based. It's based in visual culture studies, thinking about how images were produced, how they were distributed, and how people reacted to them. So this is not, and I have to preface all talks I do with this up front, this is not a technological deep dive. This is not an in-depth study of Hasselblad cameras and how they came to be part of the space program. That's a really challenging thing to do when you're faced with, the paper trail that exists within NASA and or doesn't exist in this case. And so trying to recreate those stories can be very challenging as a historian. But I wanted to separate this into topics based on that material culture studies format of looking at production, dissemination, and consumption. And so how do these images really speak to not only those elements, and how can we look at images and the production of the images in that way, but also how do they connect to a bigger picture, and not just the bigger picture of the 1960s, but the bigger picture of exploration in general. So there's obviously been lots of opportunities for people over the years, over the decades, to use cameras in efforts to explore our world. So what did it look like then? And I noticed as I looked through those images, I started to see some similarities. There were some common themes that were developed, that there was always a picture of this and there's always a picture of that. And there's something that's common to all of them. And so I follow this sort of trajectory through the book to talk about technologies, to talk about the people that they're for, and how those images got to those audiences. So say, how did a company that might be interested in oil deposits in the Middle East use images from Gemini astronauts to study that land? And of course, there's a satellite program that's kind of, in the background of all of this as well, that could then provide this without a human being behind the camera. And like I said, there's also the element of the historic exploration component to the book as well. And then, where does that all go from there? We all, have seen these images reproduced and reprinted and reused in many, many, many ways. So how does that reuse sort of solidify it as a shared cultural memory? And then, of course, there's everything that comes afterwards. The story of photography in space doesn't end there. And I couldn't hope to go over the same territory after 1972 or 75 in the same way, because there's just obviously an explosion. And I really went through all of the images through image indices and things like that to look at just how many images featured the things that I thought were important. But where this project began for me is seeing this photograph. And of course, I put it in a very particular orientation, and that's in part because of my conversation with the photographer, Bill Anders, astronaut on Apollo 8, who took this photograph. And in thinking about the person, not just the camera, just not the photograph itself, but the person taking the photograph, I wanted to capture basically what is that entire story? What is that moment like? What was that moment like? And so in 2008, in preparation for my dissertation, I wrote an article about this moment. And one of my museum colleagues managed to get it in Bill Anders's hand. And so we had a couple of chats actually about the intent in that moment and what his recollection was of that moment. And so I got an opportunity to capture some of that in the book and in the dissertation, and just to think about how it was he was seeing it and what his intention was in that moment. And what I found interesting is that while you don't often see it in its proper orientation or the intended orientation, which is what you see here, when he was in the spacecraft, since there's no up or down in space, he was actually looking at it 180 degrees differently from this view. So in his view, the moon was on the left instead of being on the right. This is the view sort of as you might think of it if you want to orient yourself, you know, as gravity might hold you today. Of course, if you were standing on the surface of the moon, it would look very different. It would look like a landscape, a traditional landscape. And so we see it in all these different views, but I've always found it really interesting that his actual view in that moment was with the moon on the left. But this was what he intended. This is what he wanted to see and really capture about their experience on Apollo 8. But where did astronaut photography begin? I have to start, of course, at the beginning, and it's with cameras like this handheld camera that John Glenn picked up at a drugstore after getting a haircut in Cocoa Beach. This is a camera within the museum's collection. It's obviously something that's really important to our storytelling about how astronauts began this process. And it's not just their story, it's the story of people who are improvising to make it possible to fly cameras in space. And so my initial chapter looks at this trajectory from the ANSCO camera here, or Minolta, as many of you, Minolta Hymatic, as some of you might know it, but looks at, you know, what were the things that needed to be taken into account, and where did all of these things come from? And I know Cole Rise a few weeks ago talked a little bit about this as well, is how NASA was working to kind of improvise solutions to basically make these cameras operable in the hands of people with spacesuits. And so you'll see lots of modifications. I'm the daughter of a tool and die maker, so whenever I see metal that's been bored out and with the little holes and extra little handles, having handled this camera myself, I can tell you that that handle is very lightweight. The camera itself is very heavy, and so that kind of balance issue always kind of came in mind for me. But again, I'm subject to gravity. John Glenn wasn't, so for him it was actually fairly easy to manage, other than the fact that film was floating around. And so you could see in these early stages astronauts thinking about what are the things that really I need to take account of when I'm doing this kind of work in space. And it's just really exploration in a very pure form. It's also exploration of the technology. So what kinds of technology actually work for this? This is, you know, a camera that was sort of high, you know, it was easy to use. That made it a good candidate for an astronaut. But then what do we need to take into account going forward? And so going forward, obviously, things turn to something that's more flexible, that has different capabilities in terms of being able to make modifications. Not only did NASA look, I think, for the ability to have a camera that was very easy for astronauts to use generally, they looked for someone on the other side of this, the provider, willing to assist them. And so it's not just about having, and NASA had plenty of photographers on staff to be able to know all of the different brands. They were, you know, very skilled photographers. So they had Leicas, they had they had Hasselblads, they had all of the kinds of things that you can imagine being available in the early 1960s. But it's guiding astronauts and the program itself to a decision point about what camera is really going to be the most flexible, give them the highest quality images, and be the most capable of being utilized for different purposes. And so it has to have different applications. It has to be able to be used in different applications, because it's not just about your traditional tourist photography that we might think of this as. It's for scientific photography as well. So can you put different kinds of lenses on it? Could you put these together in some kind of a system that then could take special kinds of photography of the Earth or of different places? Can you put different kinds of film on the back, different speeds? And so there needed to be this flexibility component. And so I go through that, some of that story and that consideration that went through, especially the early Mercury program, and of course leads to the end of the program when the last 2 astronauts to fly in Mercury used the first Hasselblads. And this one here is the Hasselblad that Wally Schirra used. It sold at auction a few years ago to a collector. And the auction house was kind enough to let me use this image in the book. And you can really see the amount of wear that this has gone through. I'm always fascinated by the character of the actual cameras, you know, at this stage in their lives when they are now, you know, something like 60 years past their usage. But you can see how banged up it gets. Of the scratches, and whether that's from flight damage, just, you know, bouncing around inside the cabin, or if it's from kind of post-flight, you know, showing off to your friends or whatever it might have been. The camera, it definitely shows its age, but it gives it a certain kind of patina that is really kind of fascinating to get a chance to look at. I got a chance to see the camera in person a few years back, and it was just, obviously, I kind of, for someone like me who thinks of this historically, this is sort of my, you know, the origin story is right here in this camera. So it makes it really exciting to get to see it. But there's another origin story, an origin story that I know that Cole was speaking about a few weeks ago, and that's the rest sort of bringing the story up to the present in terms of the technology. And so while the Schirra camera was the first camera to Hasselblad to fly in space, we also have located in recent years the first of the Hasselblads to return from the moon. And so NASA, and I always hesitate to be critical of one of my, you know, most favorite institutions in the government. As a government employee myself, NASA has been incredibly generous with many things. But their records on some of these cameras were not great. And when this camera ended up in the collection of the Kansas Cosmosphere in Hutchinson, Kansas, they didn't really know what they had. And it took some digging, it took some collaboration with some folks who have been studying these lists that, you know, NASA has kept over the years of all of their inventory. It's taken a long time to determine that this, in fact, was the camera, one of the cameras that returned from the moon, and this one particularly from Apollo 14. And so when we had this on display in 2015 at the museum, we took this photograph of it, and again, you can see that, you know, things have worn away over the years. So the sticker on the bottom there, CMP for Command Module Pilot, or sorry, Lunar Module Pilot. Command Module Pilot would have had a different camera entirely. You know, that sticker is kind of worn off. You can see some of the modification, the tabs, you know, the button that's been added, the Velcro, the ubiquitous Velcro, I like to call it. Things that are really important to help make it possible for astronauts to use it are really apparent here. And you know, this is another sort of touchstone moment for me when getting to find out that, you know, there were in fact cameras that returned from the moon, and that we can study them and look at them. And, you know, while I've always said the magazines are kind of really where it is, you don't really get the whole picture of what kind of technology was used unless you can see the entire camera. So that's really an important part of it. And the photographs are really, you know, moving on to the second chapter and the later chapters, it's really not necessarily about the technology so much as the images, kind of how they're processed, who they're for. And so in this case, they're for all kinds of people. And this is an example that I use in the book of an image that's definitely not necessarily for public consumption. Still images needed to be taken for all kinds of people. They needed to be proof to Congress, our Congress, that funding of NASA was actually paying off, that they were accomplishing their tasks. But in this case, it's for someone like an engineer who needs to understand after the fact. They're never going to get to see that piece of equipment out there, that Agena. They're never going to get to actually get hands on that to figure out what went wrong. But a photograph could really help that. And so in the case of something like this particular mission, or a later mission like Apollo 13, those still images become critical in studying the faults that ended up happening within the mission, causing some of the problems. This image could also be useful, obviously, to a scientist, a geographer, or a geologist. You can see the background of Earth. There's all kinds of wonderful things to study in this image. And so the bulk of the images, and there are approximately 20,000 from this period that I study, all the way from the early Mercury images, and that includes 35mm coverage and so on. But there are about 20,000 up through the end of the Apollo program. And so you can imagine that there's a portion of these that are useful to some audiences and not others, but the largest portion of those images are really to be utilized by scientists. And so you get those studies of the lunar surface for geologists, and you get the cloud studies for folks that want to study, cloud patterns. And until we have, reliable satellites that can do this work, this is really where a lot of the Gemini astronauts in particular spend a lot of their time photographing the Earth, is to study cloud patterns and other Earth features. And so you get a lot of that. And even within the NASA documentation, the audience that falls down at the bottom of the pile here for who this is intended for is the rest of us. It's the public. It's the large majority of those of us left on the Earth who don't fall into any of the other audiences. We can look at this and get access to them in different ways. Obviously, access has improved over the last few decades, and being able to see these images online. If you ever are interested and don't know about it, one of the best places to look at images from this era is a website called March to the Moon. It was put together by NASA and Arizona State University, and they've rescanned the flight films and put those online in raw format and all different formats. And so you can go to their website and pull those. And so it's a great resource if you're looking to reproduce any of these or look at them in great detail. You can download them for free. But of course, images of exploration, really is kind of culminates in this particular moment. And so we have evidence of a human on the moon. There's so much to say about this image. I hesitate to linger on it too long because I have done a few online videos, one in particular through the museum, where I did a kind of a reading of the image. And so I went from basically how I learned to look at images for information. What are the symbols in them? What are the things I can learn about this moment by looking at the image in a very strategic way? And so going from basically like you would with a book, from the upper left to the bottom right, reading across, just like I would be reading lines on a page. What are the things I can learn? And obviously one of the biggest things we can learn is that you can see Neil Armstrong in the reflection of Buzz's visor there. So but there are lots of really cool little stories. I encourage you to go and look at our website. You can find some of those videos that we've done talking about images in particular. One of my colleagues did a wonderful one unrelated to space, but if you've ever been curious about the image of the Wright brothers airplane, the very famous image, there are lots of clues within that image that tell you the story of how that airplane got off the ground. And so it's fun to just hear someone talk about some of those details in a different way than you might normally look at this image and see. There's some incredible knowledge that can be gathered just by studying an image. And that's really where the rest of the book goes, is taking the images themselves and trying to understand something from them. One of the things I do in one of the chapters is look for those images of exploration that have some commonality with space. And so what are some of the themes that are developed, the rhetoric of the visuals of exploration, basically. So what are those things that you can see repeated throughout exploration? And I just chose 3 periods. Obviously I have my Apollo space program, but there's also exploration of the American West, which actually had photographers, professional photographers on the staff of those crews going out, taking photographs, documenting the mission, and doing it for similar purposes as to what the Apollo program was about. And so this exploration through the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s is really the time when this kind of gets established. There are some wonderful books out there about exploration of the American West with cameras, which I would definitely encourage. And there's also some wonderful books about my other subject, which is Antarctica, and polar exploration, really, generally speaking, because the themes, again, are quite similar. And we see these people often set in the setting of this place in order to help us understand and identify with these places. These are very unknowable places at the times in which they were captured. These images, these are not tourist locations, clearly. These are not yet tourist locations, I should say. And so you can see there's this path of putting a person next to some of the great landscape features like hot springs in the upper left, or these tremendous ice formations in Antarctica, or next to giant boulders that astronauts locate on the moon. And so you can imagine that these might be the kinds of things you might reproduce yourself if you were to travel to some of these locations. It's about understanding in part the scale of the human in the setting, in the landscape. And the landscape and horizons are obviously a big part of the theme. There's this theme of the sublime, you know, putting in just being in awe and almost terrified in some ways of these locations is quite common. There's also lots of themes of nationalism. There are always astronauts next to flags. There are often people exploring these other locations who've also taken flags. I have a photo in the book of the first humans to venture to the South Pole. And of course, when they got there, they celebrated by taking their picture and had their national flags present. So that's a big part of that theme as well. And another part of those themes is how did they actually get there in the first place? And this might better be placed at the beginning of the story, but how do these people get to these places? And so depicting the means of transportation is actually important because we can often identify with those means of transportation, or at least the viewers at the time would have been educated enough, hopefully, to know what these things are. And so in the upper left, you can see there are these canoes, there are rafts depicted, there are wagons depicted. It's about how people got to these remote locations. That's part of understanding the whole story. And how do you get to Antarctica? Well, you have to take a ship. In the early 20th century, mostly British and European explorers are taking these massive sailing vessels down to Antarctica. And of course, on Shackleton's expedition, the ship gets trapped in the ice, and there's this incredible story afterwards. And so often these are, you know, part of a bigger story, and the stories of those voyages are fraught, as you would imagine, as are the stories of the Apollo astronauts. There are tense moments throughout all of these, and these are incredibly dangerous things to do for their time. And so there is that story of survival and facing the environment and the challenges of the environment. And obviously with the Apollo images, that's a little bit more apparent considering everybody has to be wearing a spacesuit when they're out on the moon. You can imagine it's quite difficult to put yourself in those shoes, but having a person in those images is incredibly valuable. And that's one of the things I point out in the book. Images of people in spaceflight is a game changer, really. It shifts the way we understand it because the technology is very unusual looking. Even the lunar lander in the background of this image is very strange looking. It looks like a spider. You know, what does that thing do? What is it? How does it work? We don't really understand. But you can see a person in this image, and that's really critical to understanding the rest of what's in the image. And so when those people are there, it really changes our ability to understand things. But after the images come back, and while this is not a specific image from human spaceflight, it's to represent really what happens with these images and the importance of images that had been kind of been increasing. And so, of course, someone like Stuart Brand is involved in the 1960s and in trying to get NASA and get anyone to understand and respond to a call for seeing the whole Earth. And so these images began to become available from the efforts of NASA and other space agencies in putting satellites up, and then obviously putting people in space and being able to capture images with cameras. But it really solidifies in our mind, you know, that different perspective that is offered by going into space. And I think that's something that we still find fascinating, obviously, about images from space today, is just that it reproduces it. They become our surrogates, basically. Astronauts are our proxies, which is part of the title of my dissertation. They are the people that represent us. And so we would want to see what they are able to see, and the photographs are the means of doing that. And so something like the Whole Earth Catalog, and of course, putting things on newspapers is incredibly important. And I highlight the newspapers in particular in the book because of what they say about the importance of spaceflight in the larger scheme of things. And one of the things I did is I did 2 case studies. How often did you find, would a person have found the Earthrise image from Apollo 8 on the front cover of a newspaper? And what's the timeliness of that after the mission? And then how does that work for this image, which I have always called the whole Earth, is called the full Earth by NASA back in the 1970s, but mostly is known as the blue marble today. So how often does it appear on the front pages? And what's it set in context with? How large is it on the page? What role does science have in newspaper coverage of the day? And so you can definitely see some changes over the course of time, but also you can see what else it's competing with. Even the story of the end of the Apollo program is competing with some pretty incredible stories of quakes in Nicaragua and air raids in North Vietnam. And so the story is, for a lot of people has moved on. There's lots of polling about the time. How important did people feel the space program was? And I think, there's definitely, there's a weight to that it may be unexpected, that I talk a little bit about in the book as well. So, but this really gives you a sense of sort of the fact that, it is prominent on the page. The story of the image and the mission itself is prominent, but it is the image alone on this page. If you look for a story of this image, you have to go back to other pages in the issue. It's not on the front page, it's just the caption. And so that, I think, shows a change in the way in which we're looking at spaceflight, even by the early 1970s and the end of the program. But other things happen with images too. They are often reused. They are interpreted in different ways. I use this one as a wonderful example of an artist's interpretation of an image. Obviously, the Neil Armstrong image of Buzz Aldrin being interpreted in a very fanciful way with Jules Verne in the reflection, and sort of bringing that story of imagining space flight to fruition, via the Apollo 11 mission. And so this is this image you'll see on screen does not give this image, the actual painting, it does not do it justice. It is an incredibly vibrant painting that I absolutely adore. We have many in the collection that are like that and are really just so incredible to think about artists sort of taking these images, these photographs, having them really have an impact on them, and then creating these imagined versions of a narrative that involves both real and imagined spaceflight. So this is part of it. Many of you may have seen the movie, the documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. I use that quite frequently as a talking point to say, even though it may be spoken of incorrectly to some degree in the story of the images may be spoken of a little bit incorrectly by Al Gore, but the utilization of those images as a hinge point for him and in telling the story of environmentalism and environmental action is a really, I think, a key feature of, what images can be used for in this post-Apollo era. And we see them used in, just an incredible variety of ways. But again, the story doesn't end there. We ended up with the end of Apollo and the beginning of the space shuttle program. And there are numerous, film magazines that can be taken on each mission. You've got a lot of still image, you've got still images that are used. You've got IMAX cameras that are used. It really is just this whole period. Not only do the shuttles carry more crew, but they can carry more equipment. They can take more photographs. And in having talked to the people who actually work in downloading the images from the space station today, those millions of images and the backlog of images is kind of what's so daunting about thinking about how you would go about looking at images from this sort of shuttle era and beyond in a constructive way, or similarly to how I've done what I've already done with the Apollo era. So it's really challenging, but I bring up this image just to point out that the post-Apollo era is marked not only by the expansion of the program itself and the number of people on it, but also by the abilities of the astronauts themselves, because they can have they tend to be of different backgrounds: scientists, engineers, pilots, doctors, so many other things. Many of them bring to their experience a very strong interest in photography. And so astronauts like Kathy Sullivan and John Grunsfeld and Marsha Ivins, Tom Jones, a number of others, have really taken with them that the artist's eye. So they're going into these thinking about how can I compose an image in a way that is very artistic and thoughtful, and bringing to it not just that sort of point and shoot perspective, but really what is it that would make this look as amazing as I'm seeing it in this moment. And so this is an image that John Grunsfeld captured on the last Hubble servicing mission in 2009 that really expresses that. He's a very talented photographer in his own right, and so this was a moment that I think really speaks to so much of what his experience was about. And then one of my favorite people who certainly has advanced the ability to photograph from space and has looked at photography from space in a very dynamic way is astronaut Don Pettit, who flew to the space station and really kind of did his own experiments with photography. He came up with these really dynamic ways of making mounts and brackets that would hold cameras in positions to be able to get some of those views that you see, those stop motion type views of the aurora. He's incredibly creative, and he kind of has this Mr. Wizard kind of a character to him, where he's coming up with these creations, these ways of photographing. He created a barn door tracker in his first mission that would allow a camera to be mounted in a window, not the cupola windows, but another window, so that it could basically track across as the space station flew over. It'd be able to properly take a photograph of the Earth as they went by at 17,500 miles an hour. And so he's really advanced the cause of photography and the interest in photography in a way that I don't know that many other astronauts have done. And so he's kind of always my end point for the story, in that he's really carried on, I think, and it kind of expanded the tradition of the astronaut photographer in a way that not many others have tried or done and been successful at. So yeah, it's the space station era is definitely a new one, but I think like with, as I said, with Don Pettit, really carries on in really interesting ways the traditions of creating images for all of us. It's kind of flip-flopped a bit. While there are millions of images, I think the ability to share the images so readily on social media has really been a game changer for the astronauts, and their ability to share with us how they see all of us down here on the Earth. And that's where I'll wrap it up.
Absolutely stunning. I love the description of Don Pettit as Mr. Wizard. That's I've only met him a handful of times, but that is the perfect way to describe how he looks at a problem and goes into solving it. So again, thank you so much for this really lovely presentation. You know, we
Sure.
as Hasselblad get the opportunity to talk a lot about the technology and tools from our perspective, but that impact from the direction of cultural looking and the idea of how did this make ripples and waves down the road is really stunning. So really thankful to have you here today.
Mhm.
For our live audience today, in a moment, we'll actually be jumping to your questions. So do continue, please, sending those our way. You can open up the question box by tapping a question mark icon either at the top of your GoToWebinar app or the browser, or at the bottom of the screen. So do continue throwing those our way. We can't promise that we'll get to everything, but definitely a couple already that we're excited to get to. The book mentioned, definitely a lot of interest there, and encourage you to pick up a copy. I received mine 2 days ago and I cannot put it down. 10 out of 10 recommend personally. Through Astronaut Eyes, Photographing Early Human Spaceflight, published by Purdue University Press. It is available as an ebook, but I'm a huge fan of the hardcover copy. When things change, Jennifer, I'll be sending mine to yours for an autograph for sure. A couple of other interesting resources that will be appearing in the chat now. You mentioned these along in your talk, but don't worry, they're in the chat. If you're watching the recording, go ahead and pause the screen. I promise we'll be here when you get back. Honestly, this was a complete rabbit hole for me to discover and go down. So 10 out of 10 recommend. I mean, just gateway to the astronaut photography verse is for me personally inspiring because it's familiar names, but March to the Moon, hours you could spend there just exploring the history of space exploration and really the early steps of where we got to where we are today. So
Yeah, I would say the Gateway one in particular, because it's current, it's updated constantly with new images, is fascinating. When I do talks in different locations, I have a habit of going to that, and you can actually select your own location on Earth through a number of different methods. and basically, you know, see what astronauts have photographed of different locations on Earth. And so whether you're in France or in Chicago or, you know, in the Amazon, it doesn't matter. You can go there and you could find an image from going all the way back. I know that for sure they have all the Apollo images in there. And so it's kind of a fun way to, I've shown it to my kids before. It's a fun way to show that when we look up in space, we can see the space station, but they're also looking down at us too, and sometimes taking pictures of us, which is kind of fun to connect those pieces.
Definitely, definitely. Well, let's hop on over to our audience questions that have come in so far, and we'll start with Ray, who asks us, in the book you mentioned that basically from the get-go there's an exponential growth in the number of images captured. Uh, as we're transitioning to space missions from private companies, how is this impacting collections, archives, from your perspective as a curator?
Yeah, so it's really complicated because, you know, NASA, you may be aware, NASA does not technically own anything that flew on the recent SpaceX mission. This is a service that NASA has paid for. And so, like you might pay for, and I hate to make this equivalency, but it's a very relatable one. If you've ever taken an Uber, you don't own the car, you're just paying this for the service. And so, you know, those items, while the astronauts are still technically NASA astronauts, they're government employees just like me. Their work is on government time. They're using services and equipment that don't belong to them. And so it's a little unclear right now. Now, I know now SpaceX has a very strong interest in its own story. They are preserving their own story. They are saving their spacecraft or using them again for other reasons. And so it really remains to be seen exactly how that's going to become accessible to other people. What kind of an archive could they develop of anything that would be considered SpaceX property versus NASA property? Because of course, if it's paid for by NASA in a sense, the images themselves may be something that goes into the NASA archive that exists of images. And so I don't have a great answer for that, but I think there are a lot of situations like the spacecraft itself. Could it come to the Smithsonian someday? I think the astronauts were asked that in an interview yesterday. There are a lot of unknowns yet about how this is all meant to go, and there are some mixed signals, but hopefully we can sort that out. I mean, the good thing going for this entire story is that there is a strong sense of history, a strong sense of responsibility to the public to save history. And so I don't think anything that's been done is going to go anywhere anytime soon. So we'll at some point should be able to access any of that stuff that's on the private side as well.
Glad to hear it. Our next question is from Terry, who asks, if given the opportunity, any one of us, what value would it be to recover the cameras that are still on the moon?
Well, I think it would have an incredible value now as a curator in particular. One of the things that we know, you know, as an example, that image I showed of the astronauts standing at Surveyor 3, one of the really interesting things that they did was they took the camera off the top of Surveyor and brought it back. And it's actually here at the museum now. And we were able to study, scientists and engineers were able to study what happened to that camera in just the short time that it was actually on the moon. What kinds of things did it encounter? Without an atmosphere, lots of things happen on the moon that, you know, may affect that surface differently than it would affect us. We've got a nice atmosphere around us to protect us from debris, but was there any debris that might have hit those cameras over the years? There's no wind, there's no erosion, there's no water, you know. So what would be the effects of radiation, which is really the #1 factor? People often ask about the effects on the flags, and it is a bit of a downer of a story in a way, in that those flags would by now be so washed out because of the radiation having discolored them that they would still have the same, you know, that you could still tell that there were stars and stripes there, but you wouldn't see the actual colors. And so I think with the cameras too, you'd see some effect in that respect. But I know our conservators at the museum would love to get their hands on something like that to really understand how you might preserve that, since it's been on the moon now for so long. As a curator too, I would be incredibly anxious, though I am not interested in any way in going to find them myself.
Certainly understandable. Our question from Rosa is, in the transition from film to digital, a big part of technological process, but also especially in the shuttle era, what was the biggest noticeable impact that you had on images for curation and archives?
Well, one of the things that's true about how the Smithsonian works versus how NASA works is we're not actually responsible for the images themselves. That is NASA archival material. It's obviously publicly available because of NASA's status as a government agency. So we collect the equipment, and we collect the material evidence, and they're collecting the images themselves. So that includes all of the flight films, that would have been used up until the transition to digital, and now, of course, all of the digital assets that are coming down from the station. And for those who don't know that story, it's really a fascinating one. I've listened to some of the interviews done with the astronauts who were on board the space station at the time that this transition was really kind of, I don't want to say forced, but when we couldn't get the flight films back from the station because of the loss of Columbia in 2003, it really changed the way that NASA needed to approach how it was doing its work with photography. Because if you can't protect those films from the radiation, how are you going to potentially save anything to return to Earth if you have if you experience a long delay in a return of a spacecraft? And so without something to bring back film, it's a lot easier to just take digital images and send those down electronically. And so that transition is really, obviously has there are a number of sad aspects to that. I'm a big fan of film photography. I still, you know, I much prefer looking at those older images even now. There's just something about their character and the fact that I know that there's a tangible product there somewhere in an archive in a cold vault somewhere in the Southwest that it makes them special in a different way. But yeah, it's something that, you know, I think for us, for myself as a curator, it kind of indicates that, you know, that it is a giant leap essentially. I think NASA had probably planned on continuing film photography for some time, even though they had been slowly moving to digital. I think, you know, it was just sort of a clear indicator that it needed to stop, which is kind of sad.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, just as a technological and the scales of economy, it was a tough one. But a great related question from Vincent about the use of Hasselblad post Apollo, which I'm glad to field. It's actually a topic of another webinar that we hosted. But Hasselblad cameras, the Apollo was really one of the first steps, and well into successful missions, and then into the shuttle era with cameras like the 203S, which is a modified focal plane shutter camera. But in a second, we'll link to or mention other Hasselblad webinars, including our history in space, which is a much more technical approach, a different perspective of here. But our one question from Menno: what is or how do you tell the right orientation of the photo? So between a prism or a finder and the film, the positive from the slide film, how do you tell if it's oriented correctly?
So one of the resources that was listed there is sort of been my Bible, I guess, and it is a very simple way to look at it. But when the cameras returned, the film magazines were processed. There is a way to basically determine that based on how those were, you know, on the roll of film itself. And so the Apollo Image Atlas to me is sort of the go-to catalog, basically a simple catalog to see exactly how those would have been captured. And so, you know, you can imagine, you have to use a little bit of imagination from time to time to really put yourself in the shoes of an astronaut and really understand that you could be any which way inside that spacecraft. It's a very uncomfortable thought for most of us to try and imagine what it would feel like to be in space and to be able to basically roll your body and change your perspective so dramatically from one image to the next. And so I've utilized that image atlas to really understand how those each frame kind of was processed. The March to the Moon website does that too. It's just that the Apollo Image Atlas has much smaller images in that, and it's shown in a sort of gallery format, so you can kind of scroll through them much easier and kind of look at how exactly those went on to the rolls of film, as opposed to how they've been processed and then later, you know, reoriented and manipulated by others. And so it's kind of, like I said, it's a little bit of my Bible and looking at exactly how you know, what the intent was a little bit more so than, you know, how we might want to think about them. And the image that, you know, is used on the title slide the image of that Michael Collins took of the lunar module with the Earth in the background is exactly the sort of opposite, not opposite, but what we would expect to see if we were standing on the surface of the moon. And so this is a much more familiar and comfortable point of view for us. But astronauts could and other than when they were on the surface of the moon, could flip their bodies in all different kinds of ways. And so it is a very difficult thing to do, to try and really capture what it was, how it was, the astronauts were doing their work. But there are a few instances where it's worth digging into to try and figure out if that's what they really meant.
Definitely hard to tell up from down when there is no gravity at all. Um, Especially with the book and the investigation in the Apollo era, what observations do you have around the transition from black and white to color film?
Well, they're used simultaneously and for different purposes. And that's another thing I talk a little bit about in the book, is just the fact that, there are some key markers, literally some markers in the images that kind of explain to the novice viewer that this image is for a different purpose, that this image has an audience that is different than just you and me. The fiduciary lines to be able to use for photogrammetry, and just the use of the black and white images, I think, speaks to that other audience. And that's when you look at the complement on each mission of how many color film rolls versus black and white film rolls that they had, kind of gives you a sense of the different purposes of photography and the different utilizations across the board. And so using black and white photography, say on Apollo 12, like the image I used, had a different purpose. It wasn't necessarily just to be, kind of artistic, though there was an artist in the image. It's really to imply, to really highlight the contrast and to bring out what is it that's useful for, say, a scientist or an engineer about images that are in black and white versus color. They did on later Apollo missions take color charts so that you could actually, they could actually, properly do all of the adjustments later and understand what was in the image. And so again, it's really about it changes over the course of the mission. So the first few missions are very simple, straightforward. Take an image, capture a panorama by just literally turning your body and snapping images. Things get much more complicated as time goes on. And so the utilization of those different formats, different speeds, it's all very planned out. It's all very thought out and practiced ahead of time. And that's another point I make in the book, is none of this is done sort of on a whim. Rarely is it done on a whim, I would say. It's not never, but the astronauts are not really improvising in the way that you or I might improvise if we're caught in a really interesting circumstance with a camera and we just happen to get something that's really amazing. There are very rare instances of that, but I think those are the ones that actually have become very iconic in their own right. It's those moments that feel the most human to us, that surprise us and surprise the astronauts, that have become such a big deal.
Definitely, definitely. Well, our last question from the audience comes from a familiar name, Cole. Given the access that you have, what is your most memorable or your favorite artifact that you've been able to handle?
Well, it's strangely enough, and I was just asked this yesterday by a colleague. We're gathering some of these kinds of stories from curators right now, and so it's a great question. He must have, been able to read my mind, that this is something I was already thinking about. But I mentioned earlier that I will say I have two, and it's from two different time periods. I'm the daughter of a tool and die maker. My dad has had his own company since the early 80s, and I have an unusual appreciation for the machining of metal. It sounds a little unusual, but I'm from the Midwest, and I'm very much from a blue collar background. And so there is something about the handmade quality of certain things that really appeals to me. It really speaks to me. And so that John Glenn Ansco camera, because of the modifications used and the way I know that those were done, to me, it just says something really amazing about improvisation that's happening and creativity and that sort of hands-on quality, the sort of very rough quality of it all. The very refined version of that is actually our IMAX camera that came to the museum in 2012. And it's just looking at the surface of the metal, it's just, you can see the machining on it. It is absolutely gorgeous. I really appreciate the sort of ingenuity and the sort of some of the features of that camera that had to be added on later for those who don't know the story. The way the camera, there's a a very large film magazine that attaches to the camera body, and there is a belt that drives it. Well, that belt during its first use in space was exposed, and an astronaut, Judy Resnick, got her hair caught in that. Now, that story was not told until one of the astronauts' autobiographies came out, so I can speak freely of it now, even though I knew of it before. But her hair got caught in it, and so they actually created and fashioned a cover for that belt for the next mission, and of course it velcros underneath, so they could assemble the camera and disassemble the camera and then put that guard on and take it off very easily. So, but it's that ingenuity and that sort of ad hoc nature sometimes of things that are done even for photography's sake, that just, to me, it just speaks to something, I think, from my own past that I never expected to connect with. I don't think in coming in as a curator to the collection in the like around 2005, I ever would have thought, oh, this is going to mean something to me on a sort of personal level in the same way that seeing other kinds of machined things would, and it's really surprised me. But we all look for that, I think, hopefully in our careers and in our jobs. There's just not something that ties us to it that's deeply personal, and so that's something that getting to see those cameras is always brings a big smile to my face.
Definitely, definitely. And hopefully soon we can return to the Air and Space Museum and see the exhibits in person. But for now, one last reminder, do pick up a copy of Jennifer's book, Through Astronaut Eyes, Photographing Early Human Spaceflight. Again, an excellent, excellent read. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I very much appreciate it. And obviously, having a Hasselblad camera on the cover of your book, really, it's very special to get the opportunity to speak to a community that is so intimately tied to the story I'm trying to tell.
Very much. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
For our future sessions, do make sure to check out a very exciting month of events that we have lined up this August, even starting tonight at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 2:30 p.m. Pacific. We'll be hosting travel photographer, automotive photographer Shelby Nick, a prolific user of the X1D series of cameras and lenses. Looking forward to that chat. On the 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific. We'll correct that typo. We'll be chatting with Austin Mann, an X and H system user who literally has circled the globe multiple times, including a project photographing and collaborating with world-renowned musician Yo-Yo Ma. On the 25th, we'll be chatting with Chris Cafaro, who has photographed the likes of famous musicians like George Harrison to George Michael. I'm sure that will be a wham of a chat. And at the end of the month, my colleagues over the pond in London will be hosting a technical webinar on focus bracketing with the X series cameras. Certainly a highly requested topic and certainly going to be interesting to watch. We did mention a couple of our previous webinars, so it's as easy as popping on to YouTube and searching for Hasselblad webinar. We've got a playlist of our past sessions there. And in the recording, we'll also include a couple of links to Hasselblad's History in Space, our chat with Cole Rise, and even chats with NASA photographers today. That being said, this is the end of today's session. We're so thankful to have you join us this morning, afternoon, or evening, and we'll see you next time.